Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Digital Power Peer Assessment Program Project Showcase for Cohort 3. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Stacy Erdman, and I'm serving as the project director on this project. Our peer assessment program is generously funded by an IMLS Laura Bush 21st Century Librarian Grant. We're currently wrapping up phase 1 of the grant, with our first 3 cohorts nearing the end of their work on the project. These cohorts have spent over a year getting to know one another and supporting each other as they learned about and completed different digital preservation assessments. They will share some of the highlights of that work with you today. And you can read more about the program by visiting the Digital Power website, and I can paste that into the chat. We previously held project showcase events for cohorts 1 and 2, and you can find links on our website to watch those recordings if you'd like. We will be gathering feedback from our first 3 cohorts on how to improve the program, and then we'll begin recruiting 18 participants for phase 2 sometime this fall. And I'm really proud of cohort 3, as this group has suffered a little bit more bumpiness than our other 2 cohorts did, as their cohort facilitator had to leave the program unexpectedly earlier this year. But luckily, our cohort 2 facilitator, Sam Meister, was able to step in and help lead them to completion. Sam is traveling this week and unable to join us, unfortunately, but I just want to extend a huge thank you to him for stepping in on such short notice and keeping this group on target. And cohort 3 actually has 6 members who completed the program. So no one dropped out, and some of the folks had some job changes, and so that's quite amazing. 5 of the cohort members are joining us today to give their presentations live, and the 6th has submitted a pre-recorded presentation for us to watch. Says she's undergoing a move to a new job right now. So let's go ahead and get started with our first cohort member, Hannah Abelbeck.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to my presentation. I'm really thankful to have been chosen for this program and to have participated in it. I work at the New Mexico History Museum. I am the curator of photographs and archival collections, and I will get into a little bit of what that means in my context. I can figure out how to get my slide. Oh, there we go. Okay, so here's just a little bit about my institution. I work in a museum setting. I work in a cultural heritage organization, and that's great. And for many reasons, what we do as archivists is theoretically understood as a major part of the organization's mission. However, we are not in a special collections or academic library setting where we're working among and with librarians and archivists. In fact, we seldom report to leaders who know and think about archives first. And we often are getting pulled into tangible support for interpretive projects. That means long-term archives work takes a back seat to the museum's outward-facing concerns, and collections care is not always as much of a priority as the next event or exhibit. And that's true for collections in general, but it's very much true for digital preservation. So I work in a state agency. That's great. We have a public-driven mission to serve the people of the state broadly and to preserve and promote New Mexico history. Awesome. Like, that's perfect for archives. However, we're not a wealthy state, and predicting and securing state and private funding is super challenging. Archives and cultural heritage are not the top priority for the state as a whole. And as archivists, we sometimes have to advocate for solutions that are not of front of mind, even in our agency, which is the Department of Cultural Affairs. Another great thing is we can bring big resources to things occasionally, but it also means that we work with procedures, protocols, and priorities not meant for archives. And then we have a lot of siloing and solve it yourself expectations within my institution, even in my department. And archival collections. This is an amazing strength of ours. We're a really old institution, and that means we have a legacy. That's a good legacy and a bad legacy. We've inherited great collections from the past, and we also have over a century's worth of non-contemporary decision-making in our archive. So even though the museum itself is over 100 years old, some of our collections and functions predate even the 100-year-old museum. So our history library department, which I oversee, is an institutional successor to the state's first library, founded in 1851. And we've inherited photographs in our collection that someone here collected in the 1880s or 90s, or others that were created for the museum system in the 19-teens. We have all kinds of archival collections, and we are still collecting. That means analog and born digital materials. You may not know it from the outside, but the New Mexico History Museum is probably the 4th biggest archive in the state of New Mexico, in terms of the number of collections we have and how many people we serve. The value and importance of our legacy collections, right? The things we have and the things that we should have done, the ways we collected and the ways we didn't, and even the whole idea of being a collecting institution as a museum seems to be somewhat in flux. So those were the opportunities and the challenges, but more acutely, we have other challenges recently, and these have shown up in my participation in the POWRR program. COVID really impacted our staffing. We were at half staff for probably 2 years. It completely changed our budget and planning. And that's on top of long-term under-resourcing. Both the library and photo archives department that I oversee were reorganized. They used to have separate heads, and now there's one, it's me, and that has led to new roles. When I started the project, I was the photo archivist and was thinking about implementing digital preservation just for the digital assets I managed. And in the course of the project, I had to take on more of an administrative and supervisory role. I was no longer able to be the implementer, but that didn't make it any less important. In fact, maybe it made it twice as important. And then in particular, our IT resources have been challenged with everything else. But digital preservation is a major need for us, right? We have unique holdings. They're in high demand. We serve the public, hundreds of people every year in person and remotely. We do file requests for all sorts of projects, from magazine articles to YouTube videos. And that's only with a fraction of our holdings. Most of them are inaccessible. We inherited a prior digitization push. We had made big gains, digitized, 30,000 files. But that didn't mean that there was a long-term plan for what to do with those files and how to keep digital preservation active and new. You can kind of figure out underwater and overwhelmed is sort of where we were as a department. Competing priorities, lack of experience, lack of my own experience, and the complexity of all the things that we'd need to do for digital preservation. But most importantly, what we were invested in is a viable future. Tomorrow's history making demands digital access to the things we've already created and access to born digital things that are still being created. And that's why I was so excited to participate in the Digital POWRR program. The peer support was great, being able to interact with and talk to other people who weren't the advisors, weren't working in an academic institution where there was an IT department or a metadata librarian is really nice, because I think a lot of archivists, a lot of people in the field are working in more challenging environments compared to maybe the people who have time to publish advice or run training programs. But also having the mentor support during the program was also really great. You know, there were times where, you know, I needed to make a call on what format to store an archival motion picture film transfer, and I didn't know about the MKV format, and you know, someone was able to easily point me to that being a slightly more compact. All of that stuff was really great, because the number of, you know, the learning curve and the number of small decisions that one has to make, especially when you're starting from deficits or lack of experience, can really sort of tank your momentum, and having those timely interventions was amazing. What was also great, and I'll talk about this more, is the achievability of the assessments. Instead of landing on a page right at the end, sort of at the end, or the you know, high phase of digital preservation, you know, these the rubrics and assessments that we used made things achievable to assess, and made them achievable to sort of benchmark, and to take next steps on. And the action-oriented part was really nice for me, right? You know, some of the SAA trainings can be very abstract and theoretical. But the hope with this program, of course, was that we were going to do something with it. So I really appreciated that. So I was asked specifically to reflect on the different assessments that we did. So the prompts across all the activities that we worked on were really useful. And some of them had more than others, right? The NEDCC one had a lot more prompts, but that for me generated a lot of clarity, helped me identify the questions that I hadn't been asking or hadn't been thinking about, and sort of pushed me into generating new ideas for what I should do. The NDSA levels, I think, you know, my response to the initial survey was alarming, right? There's a lot of zeros. There was a lot of zeros in mine, and some ones, but it was also very digestible, right? To have it all on one page and to see, right, here's how you could move from 0 to 2 in the first column was really a nice boiling down. The DPC RAM to me was the most helpful because it was slightly more comprehensive than the levels, and kind of pointed more towards a roadmap maybe. But taken together, doing the assignments, you know, legitimized, you know, some of my concerns, and what we need to do next, which is really valuable. Again, you know, I can have as an archivist a gut level sense of like where the field is and where I need to go, but to articulate that to, you know, my administration, this really helps, you know, ground it a bit more. And then again, gave a better picture of our baseline, where we are now, and then the next steps. So my thought was, oh, I would join this program at the end. I'd have this bag of tools, and I'd already have taken that first flight, be a pioneering aviator. Reality is probably more like there's a lot of pig washing that one has to do, and not to sort of sit here too long, but I think my expectations for how fast I'd be able to move, you know, to me, going through the models and having the time in this program also means that I have to rethink how fast things move and how much support I can get. So if there were other parts of, and these are like lessons learned too, some of the examples from the peers as they develop project outcomes were very helpful to me during this process. And if I had suggestions for how to improve this, more peer examples of different preservation workflows and would be really helpful. and maybe more examples of like peer pitches to their administration, those sort of tools that are not like at a high level, but kind of like at our level would be really helpful. And so I would say overall, like I thought maybe by the end of this process, I would have, moved more of my red squares to pink. And to me, it's actually, I need to reframe this so that I'm thinking more in like institutional change, maybe even to more years out where I am. And so this is where I'm focusing as I'm leaving the program. Institutional capacity. We need to articulate priorities more than I expected, perhaps. And some of the assessments that had that institutional framework and institutional questions beyond text solutions are valuable, especially for the kind of situation that I'm in, that actually this is an important part of the process. It's not just, oh, I have to learn how to use Baguette, which I do, but also having that ongoing framing of this and to make it a priority is really important. So, and now that I'm a supervisor, I can actually do that for the people who are going to have to be implementing and managing these workflows in the long term. So I'm actually excited about that, again, in the longer sense. And to focus on solutions that increase our capacity. We, instead of doing some of the more back-end digital preservation stuff, we've decided to move forward with the digital asset management system transition right away to address some of those concerns, maybe in a more umbrella way. Break it down, right? All of these rubrics were really helpful in identifying those concrete steps that would really make a step from one level to another, and to really think about workflows, the small goals, right? While you're thinking big. Also, again, those benchmarking steps are really important, and persistence. So like I mentioned, my expectations and reality were a little different, but I think some of the continual learning emphasis in some of the frameworks and in the whole project was, I think, probably the most valuable, that this isn't a one and done thing that you can just be like, okay, digital preservation, it's over, check. And so I'm also going to be rethinking some of those assumptions as we move into the next year and think about ways I can build my team so that it's not just me, it's many hands, and maybe to think across our cultural heritage institution. In fact, just last week, I had a meeting with another archivist at another museum who has a new project and is starting to think about digital preservation. And I was able to point her to some tools and talk about embedding metadata. So even if our workflows are still, in the launch phase, I was already able to help someone else, and that's been really great. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Hannah.
Yeah.
Up next, we have Rebecca Benson.
All right, let me share my screen.
And I'll just say too, we'll save all our questions for the end. We'll let everybody do their presentations first. Thanks.
All right, so I am mostly going to be talking about my experience going through this program at the Missouri Botanical Garden. But I can't start there. So I first applied for this program when I was an adjunct instruction librarian at St. Louis Community College. I have a personal interest in archives and special collections, so I, mostly of my own volition, with the support of my supervisors, of course, dove into the archival collections at the college and had been working with them. I started at the college in January 2020, which, as you can imagine, made for a very interesting time there. But the archival collections in the fall were mostly isolated individual locations, so I was allowed to come back to campus to work on them. So in the fall of 2021, I saw this opportunity for the POWRR program coming up and thought, this would be great for the college. We have all of this material, some of it digital, some of it digitized, and very little overall intellectual control of it. And I thought that this would be a great framework to start out with. The college has no formal archivist. As I was going through our archival materials, I found complaints about that fact starting in the mid-1970s. The collections themselves started at the founding of the college in 1962. But the first several months of the POWRR program were really useful for me. Completing things like the NDSA Levels let me leave a more comprehensive understanding of the current challenges for the archival collections when I left that position at the end of June last year. It was another of those, so I noticed a theme starting back at the college that transferred on to my time at the Botanical Garden in the challenges that some of these institutions with purposes outside of materials preservation or library and archive style materials preservation is that smaller institutions often have IT that has to do too much in too many capacities and can't be pulled in to spend lots of time thinking exclusively about libraries, archival material, and so on. But it did give me a good opportunity to talk to the college about what it could do in the future when they had the bandwidth to work on digital preservation. But at the end of June last year, I left my adjunct position at the community college and joined the Missouri Botanical Garden as a catalog librarian. The garden's mission is in many ways great and very aligned with digital preservation, digital access to materials, and the purpose of most archivists and librarians. So I was and still am really excited about what we can do with the materials at the garden. One of the things that was interesting for me was coming in with the POWRR program following me was it gave me a really interesting framework to start learning about my new institution. And so I learned that there were three big digital initiatives and a fourth one that I really have no access to that I'll mention later at the garden. So Tropicos is our big herbarium specimen database. Now, the central collection at the garden, the central collections at the garden are living collections, herbarium collections, and then the library and archives. Our herbarium is about to celebrate its 7 millionth accessioned specimen. And there are millions and millions of images in this Tropicos database. So it brought up a whole new set of questions about digital preservation in this constantly changing relational database infrastructure. We also have the Illustrated Garden project, which is where most of our digitized archival material lives. A lot of it's been cataloged. Our archivist uses controlled headings so you can find images and stuff, but it is heavily geared towards the photos as opposed to the archival material, the written archival material collected by the institution. We were founded in 1859, and our archival material actually goes back a good 30 years before that because we have all of the founder, Henry Shaw's papers. And a lot of that is stuff that I at least would love to see more accessible, but is also politically dicey for the institution because Missouri was a state of enslavers and Henry Shaw was one of them. So there are interesting institutional complications that I wouldn't have thought of until I started talking to people about these digitizing priorities. What I have the most control over is Botanicus, and through that, the Biodiversity Heritage Library. This is less archival. BHL focuses on natural history monographs and journals, rather than your, traditional manuscript letter photo material. It's one of the places that we actually have the most stable digital preservation framework, but that's because we are relying wholly on the Internet Archive, which is one of those things that made me realize as I was putting together these assessments, it's not possible for my institution to do a single digital preservation assessment. It needs to be taken in chunks. How is our digital preservation for digitized books? How is it for these relational databases like Tropicos? Our other big database that I mentioned is the Living Collections database that tracks every plant planted in our garden now and for several decades in the past. So you look up a specimen and it says, accession 1980, currently dead, or accession 2023, currently planted in this garden, this part of the garden. And one of the problems that our IT has is, in addition to maintaining, working customer service portal and public-facing website, they are also running Tropicos. They are also running the Living Plant database, and it is difficult to get focus for the library and the archives currently. Let me check how long. So these are some of the garden-wide questions that I've been asking, and trying to, one of the things that I found really useful was writing up the peer assessment reports, because it's giving me something that we hope eventually can be given to higher ups, both in my division and in the other garden divisions, to say, all of us across the garden broadly have similar priorities, or should have similar priorities, in terms of preserving and sharing all of this information that we develop, that we produce. And it would be great to have a centralized function, ideally someone in IT who has that digital preservation background and can think about maintaining all of these collections from that point of view. So my big goal, as I was working through this, I was thinking, okay, my goal can be getting the Botanicus to BHL pipeline better, or getting the things that we've digitized that we have copies of in Botanicus held onto better. But looking at the levels and then trying to write up what I was getting from them made me really understand the ways in which the entire institution would benefit from connecting these disparate pieces of digital information. So my big goal, which is unfortunately also a very, very long-term goal, is to get IT invested in digital preservation, to get them the sort of training and the sort of thought processes towards digital preservation that people in the cultural heritage sector, in archives and libraries, think about, because all of this information is stuff that we hope to have available for scholars continuing another 150 years into the future. So this was really useful to me, even if my personal experience with the POWRR program was a little weird working through multiple institutions. It really helped give me a framework for what would be most useful for these institutions to do in the future. So thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca. Next up, we have Kristin Clark.
All right, let me get my screen going. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Kristin Clark, and I'm the manager of digital collections at Texas Women's University Libraries. Let's see if we can switch slides. There we go. All right, so Texas Women's University is a public co-ed university system located in Benton with campuses in Dallas and Houston. We were recently designated as a system, so we are now the nation's largest university system focused on women. Fall enrollment was approximately 16,000, and TW Libraries itself has 55 employees, and these are distributed across the main campus in Denton, and then the campuses in Dallas and Houston as well. All right, so our collections in the TW Library, some of those include the university archives, special collections, and our scholarly works. The Special Collections Department of the Libraries is home to the Women Air Force Service Pilots Official Archive, and the WASP were the first women to fly for the U.S. military back in 1942 and through 1944 in the height of World War II. With TW being the home of the WASP archive, there are a lot of adjacent women in aviation collections that are archived with TW, including individual women aviators and women in aviation organizations. In 1979, the Women's Collection, which is Special Collections and University Archives, was designated as the state's official collection for the history of women. So because of that, there's a lot of women's history collections within the archives and women's organization collections. We also have scholarly books. So these include print theses and dissertations, which we are digitizing, electronic theses and dissertations, and scholarly publications. We have 2 access points for our digital collections currently. One is the Gateway to Women's History, which is Content DM, and that houses digitized special collections and university archives materials. And we also have the repository at TWU, which is DSpace, and that houses digitized theses and dissertations and ETDs and other scholarly publications. Our storage infrastructure at TWU includes network drives and a preservation storage solution using Amazon Glacier and Chronopolis. And this is managed by the Texas Digital Library, which we are a member of, and we use DuraCloud, which syncs with our network drives to send materials to storage. Okay, so digital preservation at TW actually started back in 2019. During that time, I was working in the Special Collections Department, and we had some file loss on our network drives. We believed that IT was backing things up, and they actually weren't. So that's when we kind of moved into response mode. And I completed my first assessment at that time in 2019, and it was actually the NDSA Levels of Preservation. I started doing manual backups, and we purchased preservation storage, digital preservation workstation, and I started doing creating a digital asset register. So a lot of technically oriented responses to our loss of files. But I had really just only done personal research for digital preservation and no formalized learning. So I really wanted to apply to this program so that I could have a more formal learning process, and I was hoping to create a plan for reformatting and archiving legacy AV material. So here are the assessments. So the first assessment that we went through was the NDSA Levels of Preservation, and I was definitely biased towards this one because it was the first one that I did. And I already had data to compare with. So that's why the NDSA ended up being my favorite. It was definitely very technical and actionable, and I agree with Hannah in that it was very digestible. What I didn't like about it was that you didn't have a lot of space to elaborate. on why you chose a certain number in your assessment, be it from 1 to, I think it was 2 or 3, I don't even know. But you can see, like, from the exam, my images, how much we moved from a lot of red to more yellow and greens since 2019. And you can see that I tried to kind of patch the lack of space to elaborate in my April and May assessments by adding in extra text at the bottom, which you could see in red. But overall, I really liked the NDSA levels of preservation the best for these assessments. My next kind of favorite assessment in this program was the peer assessment. I was paired up with Amy Moorman at Avila University, and we chose to do the co-assessment versus the more traditional peer assessment. We chose this because we each had unique climates at our institutions during this program, and we felt that we could each better speak to those climates ourselves versus each other trying to speak towards those. So the peer assessment definitely provided a more detailed view of digital preservation at the organization, and it covered the institutional viability that the NDSA levels didn't. The con for the peer assessment was just that it took so long to complete, and it was a very lengthy report on my end, and it wasn't as visual as, say, like the NDSA levels. I can't take a picture of it and put it in the slide and make it, you can see how much progress we've made or anything like that. So yeah, that's my thoughts on the peer assessment. And then I personally didn't like the DPC RAM as much as all the other ones. I didn't feel like you could visualize the results as easily as the levels, but I do feel that it would be a beneficial assessment to complete in a collaborative setting at my institution. So that's kind of in future plans of continuing assessment and to complete the DPC RAM collaboratively. It definitely was more forward thinking than the NDSA levels, but you did need supplementary documentation to complete the assessment, which you had to do for the peer assessment as well. And what I liked about the NDSA levels is that it was all together in one thing. So during the program, I felt like I made some pretty decent accomplishments with the funds provided through the grant. I was able to purchase a cassette digitization setup, and I was able to start documenting workflows for digitizing cassettes and began digitizing some of the oral history cassettes at Special Collections Archives. I began running Fixity Pro on our collections because most of our materials are on local servers. And so it was important to check those local servers and make sure that files are not corrupted or accidentally lost. So I do have Fixity Pro running now. I began bagging preservation files on local servers using Becker and creating workflows to ingest newly digitized materials into preservation storage. For the program, some of the things that I wish we had done a little bit more of was some more cross-cohort collaboration and connection. I did make connections with people in other cohorts organically, but I wish there had been a little bit more sharing just within our cohort and across cohorts and everything like that, because we're all working, in the same program towards the same goal. I personally needed a little bit more upfront learning to test the tool and testing tools and things like that. And that we had completed our assessments and set our goals a lot more quickly and left lots of time for implementation. I also found during the program how important the facilitator involvement was. When Amy and I would do our meetings and talk about our challenges and things like that, it sometimes felt like the blind leading the blind, because she would say her problems and I would say mine, and we're like, so I don't know how to help with that. So So Sam and Nick ended up being very helpful to us to help us prioritize and create action plans that would work for each of our institutions. But altogether, it was a really awesome program. Being able to complete multiple different assessments helped provide like a comprehensive view of digital preservation at our institutions instead of just the one that I had done at first. I learned how important the organizational viability was to digital preservation and how it's not just tech solutions, but it involves policies and staffing and a lot more of the harder things to take care of. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Kristin. Next up, we have Tara Laver.
Hey everybody, I am going to share my screen. Let's see. All right, hopefully you are seeing that. So first, I just ditto to everything that Hannah and Kristin and Rebecca have said. I've found myself nodding along with a lot of what they've said. So and better than I probably will say it. So thank you for the members of our cohort who were great. And like I said, I agree with a lot of things and had similar experiences to what they've said. So I am the senior archivist at the Nelson-Atkins Museum of Art in Kansas City. So I'll give you a little bit of an overview of the museum and then my institutional organizational setting as part of the library. So I've started saying that the Nelson-Atkins is probably the largest art museum in the US that you've never heard of. But opened in 1933, and we have an encyclopedic collection of over 42,000 works of art. We offer free admission to view our permanent collection and offer tours, studio classes, and other educational opportunities. Our mission is the Nelson-Atkins Museum of Art invites all people to explore the art in its care and through its broad collection, the depths and complexities of human experiences. We are a private museum funded through donations, income generating operations like event rentals and our restaurant, and also through grants. So the Spencer Art Reference Library, which you see up there on the right, is comprised of the art library and the museum archives. The library itself holds a non-circulating collection of over 270,000 volumes, and that's all in support of the museum's collection strengths. Our primary user group is our museum staff and docents, local art and art history students. The Kansas City Art Institute is literally just across the street from us, and so we get a lot of their students in, and artists, and to a lesser extent, the general public and museum visitors who might drop in. The library's mission is to enrich lives by facilitating users' discovery of information needed to advance knowledge, create meaningful experiences, and support lifelong learning through programs, research assistance, and access to our vibrant and diverse collections. So the archives, like I said, is part of the library. Was established in the early 90s through an NHPRC grant and serves as the corporate memory of the museum by preserving and providing access to our institution's records that document the origins, development, achievements, and activities of the museum. So we are really institutional records heavy. That is by far the largest part of the collection. But we do also have a small collection of personal papers and manuscript collections of people who are related to the museum in some way. Our primary users in the archives are our staff, but is also open to outside researchers like grad students, curators from other museums, art historians, academics. Like it said, the Spencer Art Reference Library is comprised of the art library and museum archives. The archives, I report directly to our director of the Library and Archives. And then the Library and Archives is a department within the Learning and Engagement division of the museum. And we have a deputy director who reports to our CEO and director of the museum, who in turn reports to the board, our board of trustees. So that's a little bit of our structure. And so one thing that Rebecca said that really resonated with me was one of the I was completing our assessment and looking at like the unit of reference that I was looking at was the archives and library. But I kept kind of like the museum, the larger museum kind of kept coming in and influencing it too. So I think that's probably a step down the line too, is doing this broader assessment that takes in the whole museum. But even just with me doing the archives and the library, it was challenging because we do operate fairly separately. We're very physically separate, and there's not a ton of overlap in what we do, but I'll get to that a little bit more. And I'm also not the only member with responsibilities that touch on digital preservation. As a senior archivist, I'm responsible for all aspects of our archival efforts related to analog or born digital records. In the library, in addition to cataloging, reference, and special projects, the digital and technical services librarian manages and oversees all aspects of digitizing library and archival materials. And overall, the library has 8 FTE, and 1.5 of those are in the archives. So as of May 2023, the archives holds approximately 1,900 linear feet of analog records, 2 terabytes of born digital records that are comprised of photographs, audio and video recordings, oral histories, websites, and institutional records, primarily textual, email. And those are in formats, all the Microsoft Office suite products, as well as PDFs, TIFFs, PNG, JPEG, MP3, MP4, MOV, WAV, PST files. Then we also have some digitized archival collections that were done years. I've been here 6 years, and they probably were started, I would say, in the mid 2000s. 2 terabytes of that, and that's primarily photographs and digitized audio-visual recordings. And those are stored in the archives section of our shared directory on the museum's network that is maintained by our information services department. Let's see. For the born digital stuff, I had been creating minimal metadata whenever the stuff was transferred to us, kind of your basic accessioning data, the date it was transferred, where it came from, an overall description of the materials, the size of it in bytes, files, and folders that I could get from the properties in Windows Explorer, and the date range of the materials that were created. And then managed them and accessed them primarily through the directory structure, organizing them by the originating office or record group, file naming, and that's how we, were able to access things. We also have a great deal of legacy of digital media in the collection. I've estimated about 2.4 terabytes of CDs and DVDs and floppies. Highest priority for digitization of these would be our recordings of programs that the museum has held and labeled photographs that aren't found in our DAM that is administered by our media services department. We also have about 700 legacy audio-visual recordings in all formats that will need to be digitized for access and preservation. And so those files will obviously need to be managed as well. just a little bit more of our situation. We have implemented archive space, and it's hosted by Library Host, and began capturing the museum's website monthly using Archive It in May 2017. So that's our portal there on the right, a screenshot of it. In addition, there's a now defunct unit of the library that previously had responsibility for digitizing content for the museum and managed an instance of the dam called Luna. IT decided to take that offline in 2018, but we still have the 127 gigabytes of files that were in that system, but they're not available now. But we do still have the metadata that was with that. And so our hope is to be able to make that available with that metadata again at some point. And then we have another 3.5 terabytes of data from a slide digitization project. So there's a good bit of legacy files laying around. The Spencer Art Reference Library, like I said, it's over 270,000 volumes. We also provide access to digital subscriptions like art encyclopedias, historic newspapers, art sale databases. Also have a program to create artist files for local artists. So they can have the opportunity to create a file of materials that they want to represent their career. That is maintained in the library. It's not archival per se. We're also a member of CARTA, the Collaborative Art Archive, which is a grant-funded web archiving initiative through Archive It, but that is, our library is just submitting sites to be captured. We're not doing any of the hands-on, running the crawls and the quality control and all of that and managing those files. The library's internal digitization program began in earnest in 2021, and since then has created about 283 gigabytes of digital material, primarily museum publications, exhibit catalogs, and documents from the artist files. And these are maintained on a dedicated server, and access is provided through Internet Archive because it's free. And they create basic technical metadata when the files are made, and are providing Dublin Core metadata for those. So the impetus for participating in POWRR, which you can maybe also less positively look at as the challenges. So I was looking, trying to put this presentation together, and the lightning and POWRR really struck me because it was like lightning struck at just the right time when the opportunity to participate in this program came along. I have taken workshops, I won't say lots of workshops, but had the opportunity to take several workshops on different aspects of digital preservation, like digital appraisal and accessioning, email management, as well as one on hacks for digital preservation. And this provided me with a good understanding of the general concepts related to it and a familiarity with the vocabulary, but I had not taken that next step and put any of those ideas into practice. And that was part due to my lack of confidence in my ability to implement the tools and ideas that I learned. I always, disqualify myself, say I'm not a tech person, that's not my strength. So I think that's been intimidating to me. And then I felt like there were still remaining gaps in my knowledge, some that were bigger picture and many like procedural, kind of like what Kristin was saying, was like, I think it was Kristin, this asking about a specific file type, or just things that were like, I don't know, that seemed like so small that you were almost afraid to ask them. Also, like so many people, given my other duties, I felt like I had little time to experiment with tools. Also have limited IT support and responsiveness, very much like Rebecca was saying, being at a museum, the priority for resources is public facing events and exhibitions, and archives a lot of times are not top of mind or top of the priority list. And our IT is, like so many IT departments, you know, are stretched very thin. So just not getting a lot of support there, and even lack of response to emails, questions. And then, like I mentioned, in 2021, the library started a digitization program with the purchase of an overhead scanner and approval for the new initiative from our senior leadership group. Another factor was, you know, growing Born Digital collection. The archives primarily collects the museum's institutional records, like I said, and of course, most of them at this point are Born Digital. At the same time, between 2020 and 2022, we had several key staff leadership positions. People leave those, or key functional positions. So there was a large influx of digital records at the time, but we didn't have any ingest or processing policies in place, you know, to speak of that, to deal with those. So these digital streams were coming together and reaching sort of a critical mass in terms of needing to be addressed. So when the peer assessment program was announced, it was excellent timing, and I applied. So talk a little bit about the assessments. Like Kristin or Rebecca, I can't remember. Yes, most of my stuff is ones and zeros as well. So, sorry. Most useful to me, I feel like, were the NDSA and the DPC RAM assessments. I found the NDSA Levels assessment very easy to use. The explanations are clear, and I felt like the choices allowed for a lot of latitude. Also really think it would be a good tool to use when you're talking to IT to help explain and show them how, you know, just storage does not equal digital preservation. So a good handy visual thing for those kinds of conversations. It also pointed out to me how with relatively little effort and more intentionality, I could materially improve our digital preservation efforts to move some of those from zeros and ones to twos at least. And I mentioned, I watched one of the earlier cohort showcases, and someone mentioned how great it would be to have some tools to linked from these assessments that, like, if you want to make progress in this area, here's a tool that would do that. That would be helpful, I think. The DPC RAM was also a worthwhile exercise, a useful tool for identifying and understanding the many elements that contribute to a given component. So the definitions of the rankings and effect provide target goals and activities. So I found it a good way to sort of unpack what each of those things actually entailed. Also, it was instructive to see how my target rankings changed slightly over time as I learned more and studied our situation more in depth, and came to understand that, you know, optimized number 4 in all areas did not have to be the goal. That was sort of like, well, of course I want everything optimized, but as I learned more and you know, came to realize that, you know, that didn't have to necessarily be the case. Let's see. The peer aspect of the program was helpful for having someone to commiserate and discuss possible solutions with, and I was paired with Casey, who's the archivist at Agnes Scott College. But still, my impressions of the NEDCC peer assessment model are somewhat less positive than the other two. I can see how its content and structure would be a useful tool. I think for me, the initial lack of clarity in our cohort about how to approach it, as well as the drawn out nature of how Casey and I went about conducting this, likely influences that. I also felt like that was repetitive, repeated a lot of the information we provided in our organizational profile, and was time intensive. But I think if we do undertake a museum-wide assessment of our digital practices, that I would consider using all three, because I think this one would be useful for talking to a lot of people and to promote discussion. So these are the goals that I have come up with as a result of the program. I won't read through them, but the first thing is just getting a policy down as to what we will collect, and to what level we'll preserve things, and start looking at tools that would help implement that policy. I do have funding in this year's budget to set up a digital preservation station. So I'll start working on that and creating a workflow. And the other big thing that has been somewhat of a stumbling block for me, again, going back to IT, is getting secure cloud storage. After that, I'll prioritize the Born Digital stuff that we have to set up a schedule or project for ingesting and processing it. And then in the longer term, we've got a lot, I can't remember how many now, but it's a whole record center box, like layers in it of DVDs of museum presentations that are a priority for preserving. So getting those off of that and ingested, starting to look at some of the preservation systems, especially interested in Vault, which is something that Internet Archive is developing as a preservation service. And then also hope to do some experimenting with ePad on some of our archived mailboxes of some of those key high-level staff that I mentioned having left somewhat recently at the museum. So leaving this with our reflections on our reflecting pool here at the museum, the program has definitely been useful for me to give me the time, or the motivation or the impetus to focus on, discuss, and think about digital preservation, and to more formally evaluate where we are and where we want to go. And I think another big takeaway for me was internalizing that while there are standards and guidelines, each archive operates in a different context with unique and varying priorities for what it preserves digitally, and that situation-specific approach is valid. I expect my ongoing challenges will continue to be time to work on this, concern that it's beyond my technical skill and competing with many demands on the IT department's time for support. But I do feel like the process has driven home to me that doing something is better than doing nothing, and that there are activities and processes that seem achievable and that I can build on. And then also being able to connect with so many great people in the cohort, and having the exposure and opportunity to use the assessment tools, I think will be something that I go back to over time. So just want to thank Stacy and everybody who made it possible. I would recommend the program to anyone who wants to get started with digital preservation but feels ill-equipped to undertake it, because it does provide the support and training to be able to start doing something. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tara. Next, we have Casey Westerman.
Okay, so I'm the one who doesn't have a slideshow, so this is just going to be a bit of a talking head. But just as an introduction, so I'm the college archivist and librarian for Agnes Scott College. Agnes Scott is a private liberal arts college in the Atlanta suburbs. It has an undergraduate and graduate combined population of about 1,200. Historically, it's been a women's college, but the undergraduate program admits trans and non-binary students, and the graduate programs are co-educational. The Agnes Scott College Archives, of which I'm the sole staff member, primarily serves administration, alumni, and outside researcher needs, with a small number of questions from current students. So the history of the archives. The college was founded in 1889, but there was no archives staff or archives facilities until 1989, which was the centennial anniversary of the college's founding. When they were putting together the archives, the initial collection development was based on this anniversary. So they solicited material from the alumni of the college. But in terms of the records of the college itself, initial collections were limited to presidential papers, audiovisual recordings, the records of some student groups, and a few individual faculty members' collections. The presidential papers are still restricted, not open without the permission of the president's office. So our physical collections at this point amount to around 600 linear feet, but by far the most frequently used materials in the archives are publications of the college and student publications such as yearbooks and newspapers. Because of that gap of 100 years between the founding of the college and the establishment of the archives, a lot was lost. And that's even before the digital cliff of circa 2000, which is to say that I think like most colleges and universities, we didn't get a lot of born digital material as it was being created. So beginning in 2010, the publications were digitized and posted to the Internet Archive. And those have been, again, by far the most in-demand materials. I began working at the college in 2019, and in 2020, I established an institutional repository, which is a DSpace instance maintained by a vendor. This repository now holds about 1,100 items, which includes all of the publications already available on the Internet Archive, a collection of audiovisual and photograph materials, and some born digital documents from offices and groups around the campus. And newly digitized materials added to the repository when possible. Last year, I was able to get the funding for a digitization project which added an additional 15 years of early student newspapers to our digital collections. So to talk a little about the peer assessment program, and what was especially useful for me from this was that as intended, the assessment tools allowed me to get a clear picture of my digital preservation situation. And what had not occurred to me before that was that the digital preservation work that's being done is not only the work that I'm doing, it's what's being done by our vendors and hosts. We have digital collections which are hosted internally, really just for my use and sharing around the campus on Google Drive. Everything I have is backed up there. We have what's on the Internet Archive, and we have what's in our DSpace digital repository. And between those three hosts, as I was going through the NDSA and RAM assessments, I could see that a lot of those boxes are checked not by work that I'm doing, but by the fact that it's in one or more of these external repositories. I went into the program very worried that I would learn that my archives was very far behind on digital preservation and we'd never be able to catch up. I learned, apart from the fact that much of what needed to be done was being done, I also learned that while an ideal preservation program would provide a really high level of preservation, virtually no organization the size of my employer is meeting all of those standards. So when I was trying to decide on what my next steps would be, what achievable goals would be post the peer assessment program, looking at how to, for example, how to spend the tech startup funds, my goal was to use this, this one-time expense to expand the archive's capacity for digital preservation. So I'm now planning to use the funds to purchase equipment, starting with a VHS player, which will allow me to digitize videotapes, which amounts to a massive amount of our kind of currently inaccessible collections. In the past, when funds were available, I've sent tapes out to vendor for digitization, but being able to do this in-house, you know, on a tape-by-tape basis is really going to increase my ability to provide access to AV materials, even without specific funds for digital conversion. I wanted to share some general observations which came to me while I was involved with this program. And these are not criticisms of the program, but in some cases, maybe they're aspects of digital preservation and the work that we do, which weren't necessarily addressed by the program. And I think starting off, which everyone is aware of this, the biggest limitations for an academic archives or library in general are staffing and funding. In my case, I'm the only archivist here, and I have an annual budget for the archives of $8,000. There's only so much that planning and training can do. The digital repository, the DSpace instance that I use, which is outsourced to a vendor, the budget for that is, the expense for that is $4,000 a year. It is by far the largest expense in the archives budget, and the price goes up every year. If I get grants or if funds are released for one-time expenses like outsourced digitization projects, that's fantastic, but you know, everything that needs to be done, it either costs money or time, and both of those are very strictly limited. When early on in the project, I kind of decided that maybe one thing that nobody was talking about was the fact that the pressure on us is for access rather than preservation. Certainly this was the case during COVID when my shop went entirely remote. All the students of the college were around the country and not coming in to look at materials in person. And the pressure was really on me to get the material up now, get it up quickly. And I would have been the only person who knew whether any preservation work was being done or not. All the emphasis is on access. And it seemed to me that a lot of the preservation that gets done, we have to fold it into the process of providing access, or else it simply won't be done. It's hard to make the case for resources to be devoted to behind the scenes preservation work, but you know, if you can fold that preservation in with the access, it's a lot more likely to get approved. And maybe the last thing that I want to talk about, which was really driven home for me by the fact that, you know, this process, which was, you know, planned to take, you know, 12 months, ended up taking about 18. So many people changed jobs in this time span. So in my case, I stayed in the same position, but a change in my duties happened, which was that previously I had been required to spend about 20% of my time working at the circulation desk in my library. This was because of a staffing shortage. At the start of this year, we had a change in staffing, and I was released from circulation duties, which getting that, you know, several hours a week back really increases the amount of time that I can spend on digital collections. An additional thing was that our IT department, which has been chronically understaffed, was outsourced to a vendor at the start of this year, which means that we now have much more reliable service and kind of immediate responses. But these changes could both be reversed. I could again be required to cover other essential duties at the library and lose the time I need to maintain the institutional repository. The college could terminate its contract with the vendor, choose to work with another one. The vendor who provides our DSpace might go out of business. And beyond that, if I were to leave this job for another one, there would be a complete break in the digital archival work. All archives functions would cease until my replacement was hired, and the replacement might choose not to continue any work that I'd begun. It seems like small organizations are especially susceptible to this. That planning for this kind of gap in staffing, I don't think it happens enough. Obviously, the person who leaves, you know, they may feel an obligation to provide for their successor, but they're in a hurry to go. And again, I think a real illustration of this was simply how many of us changed jobs. So that's my anticlimactic conclusion. I do really want to thank Tara, who is my peer assessment partner. Kind of working through this was just being able to explain it and hear it explained was tremendously useful for me. I want to thank Sam, who's not with us today, who stepped in and kind of brought this to an expedient end. And I especially want to thank Stacy for managing this from start to finish.
Thank you so much, Casey. Yeah, okay, so we have one more presentation that I'm going to share my screen because it's a video. And this is Amy Moorman.
Stacy, we can't hear audio.
Okay. Let's see.
Stacy, I don't know if
Can you hear now?
Unfortunately, I'm in the midst of really
Not really.
questionable right now. I was the archivist for the Martha Smith Archives and Research Center at Avila University in Kansas City from January 2020 to late May 2023. This was a solo archivist role, and therefore I was responsible for all aspects of managing the archives, including digital preservation efforts. Avila is a small private university that was originally founded by the Sisters of St. Joseph of Carondelet in 1916. The archives focus on collecting institutional records, as well as housing special collections related to women religious organizations and their history. Collection materials included rare books, records of religious orders, and documentary films such as Sisters of Selma, which documented the involvement of Catholic sisters in voter rights marches in Selma, Alabama in 1965. The Martha Smith Archives was established in 2014 after a renovation of the campus library. Its first large acquisition was of the records of the U.S. Federation of the Sisters of St. Joseph, who also donated funds to assist with the digitization of portions of their collections to be made available online to members and researchers. Other digitization projects undertaken by the archives included university and student publications, including newspapers, alumni magazines, yearbooks, etc., photographs, and women religious oral history audio recordings. Immediately upon my hiring, the archives undertook the acquisition and processing of a large born digital collection that was the result of a global project funded by the Hilton Foundation. I knew that to properly care for those materials, as well as our other digital collections, the archives needed better infrastructure and procedures in place for preservation of digital assets. And I needed the tools and frameworks to be able to bring evidence to administrators and other stakeholders on campus to make a case for those improvements. So when I saw the call for applicants for the POWRR Peer Assessment Program, I knew we were in a perfect place to benefit from the opportunity. The first assessments we did for the program were pretty straightforward to complete and provided some very helpful feedback. I particularly found the DPC RAM assessment to be helpful in my situation because it was the first that dealt with the institution as a whole. While I had done a great deal of work setting up digital preservation policies and procedures within the archives, I had not done enough outreach to records creators and other stakeholders on the importance of digital preservation and of integrating procedures campus-wide. Unfortunately, in August of last year, Avila's new administration made the decision to eliminate the archivist position and close down the archives. Special circumstances did allow me to stay in my position. Originally was to be until the end of this current fiscal year, but priorities had to be radically realigned across the board. So instead of utilizing the assessments from this program to expand and further digital preservation efforts at Avila, I was forced to pivot to leaving them as evidence of priorities unfulfilled. The administration's decision was presented as a temporary closure of the archives, so I was at least able to focus on one of my goals, which was to outreach with University IT about strengthening infrastructure for digital assets. At the time I left my position, the archives was stewarding nearly 4 terabytes of digital assets. In 2019, the archives purchased a NAS storage array with a total storage capacity of 30 terabytes. The NAS is a RAID 5 setup with the backup overwritten every 7 days. And I had advised Avila's IT director on multiple occasions that best practices for digital preservation required longer backups and redundant offsite storage. Unfortunately, I ended up having to follow up on resolving those issues myself. So before I left my position, I created a backup of the NAS to first an external hard drive, which is stored in the archive's secured stacks, and a cloud backup utilizing Amazon Glacier. Since the archive's NAS is essentially a static or closed system at this point, with no files being added to it since the archives is closed, those backups will serve as insurance of the current digital landscape. With my project peer partner, I created the NEDCC DPA assessment report for my own institution during the past winter and spring. And I think in most situations, this report would be an incredibly useful tool for visioning future goals and digital preservation planning due to how comprehensive the template provided is. But in my case, it was actually quite a frustrating experience to complete because of how quickly priorities were changing at Avila during the time that I was assessing and writing the report. I did end up leaving the report or including the report as part of my final annual report that I submitted to my supervisor and to university administration. And it's my hope that that report will inform future understanding of where I left off in securing the archive's digital assets in case the archives is ever reopened. On a more personal level, I would say this program was incredibly worthwhile and rewarding despite the uncertainty and upheaval that was happening in my workplace at the time. Completing the framework really helped expand my knowledge of the practical implementation of a digital preservation program. And I'm sure that will be useful to me in my future professional endeavors. Thank you for your time.
All right, so that does it for our 6 presentations. I just want to open the floor for any questions. And feel free to raise your hand, or if you want to pop a question into the chat, that would be fine too. And I can start with a question for you guys. I know a couple of you mentioned that you would probably be doing some of these assessments in the future. So I'm kind of curious, like now that you've done them, you're familiar with them, do you plan on, are there certain tools that you do see yourself working with as you go forward as like kind of like a check-in for how you're progressing?
I'll start. I think the NDSA levels is kind of the most, to me, the most obvious, just because it's such a snapshot of a point in time and is so visual and kind of quick and easy to do. So I think it's a good one for kind of periodically checking in and seeing, like, kind of like what Kristin showed of how it changed over time.
I have the same answer. I think I have plans to revisit that periodically to track progress and use it for benchmarking. But I think someone mentioned, I think it was Tara, you know, that even in my setting, that museum archives divide is a real thing. And I know that we're going to need to be a little more strategic. You know, and I'm not sure what form it will take yet, but there's likely to be some more working groups on digital preservation, maybe even within my institution, if not cross institution. And that's probably one that, you know, I feel like everyone can sort of manage that one.
Yeah, and I plan on, continuing to use the DSA levels of preservation since I already have data on it. And I really plan on using the peer assessment to help kind of roadmap preservation activities for the future and use it as a talking point in discussions with other departments, and in the hopes of maybe making a working group within my institution. And so that report can serve as a roadmap of our discussion, what we want to do, and then doing the DPC RAM as a part of that group in the future, because I just found all of the assessments very helpful in general. So yeah, I plan on trying to use them going forward.
Great. Yeah, I'm really interested in how some of you describe this as like a really valuable like advocacy tool for like teaching other people in your organization about your capacities, and like really coming to the realization that it's not really just one person's problem. It is an institution-wide problem, and you need other expertise and administration to help understand your needs. So I'm glad that you think this can be helpful there, definitely. Anybody else? Any other questions? I guess I would just ask you guys if you plan on staying in touch after the program ends at all.
To some extent, I know Kristin and is it someone from a different cohort? I've completely
Yes,
forgotten.
it's Jane from Cohort 1.
Yeah, are going to present a poster, I think, this fall. So at least to some extent.
I think too, just like, a lot of times, rightly or wrongly, I just feel like there's some questions you don't want to just put out there on like an SAA listserv, because you feel like I should know this or whatever. So like having somebody that you have a relationship with and that you've been vulnerable with a little bit in the past, like it'll be good to have that to folks to go back to with those kinds of things.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. All right, well, we're right at time, so I guess I will conclude the event and just thank all of Cohort 3 so much for your wonderful presentations and for your patience in all the hard work you put in. So thank you again, and thanks for coming.
Thank you, Stacy. Thanks for having the idea.
Yes, thank you, Stacy.
Bye-bye.
Bye.